The Lydia Leicester Farm, General Meade's headquarters at Gettysburg, is on Taneytown Road at the intersection with Hunt Avenue. Its central location close behind what was roughly the center of the Union lines made it a perfect location as headquarters for the Army of the Potomac. James Leicester died in 1859, leaving behind his wife Lydia and 6 children. Lydia bought the wooden 2-room house in 1861. It had a small hayfield and several apple and peach trees, as well as a spring. Lydia's sister, Catherine, had married John Slider, whose farm near Big Round Top was just a short distance away. It also played an important role in the battle. The Leicester Farm during the battle. Lydia and her 2 girls, who still lived with her, left the farm as the battle grew near. Its position on the reverse slope of Cemetery Ridge, just inside the Fishhook curve of the Union lines, made it a perfect location for the nerve center of the Union Army. Meade's famous council of war on the evening of July 2nd took place in the house's tiny main room. This nerve center was disrupted during the artillery bombardment preceding Pickett's charge. The farm's location immediately behind the central point of the attack resulted in its being deluged with numerous overshoots from the hour-long Confederate barrage. One burst among the staff horses in the yard. Others carried away the steps and porch supports. Flying splinters dictated a move outside. When Meade saw some members of the staff clustering on the downrange side of the flimsy house, the fearless, twice-wounded Meade joked with them about their imaginary shelter. But for the sake of efficiency, he eventually moved his shot-torn staff a few hundred yards away to a nearby barn. When it, too, proved to be a target, they moved on to the 12th Corps headquarters on Powers Hill, which was part of the Union Army's series of signal stations. After the battle, Lydia Leicester returned home to find her home punctured by numerous shot holes and 17 dead horses in her yard. A shell had knocked down the porch supports. Several horses had been burned around her best peach tree, killing it. Her cow and horse were gone, her apple trees were destroyed, 2 tons of hay was gone from the barn, her wheat had been trampled, her spring spoiled by the dead horses, and all her fence rails burned. In 1865, she told a reporter that all she received in compensation for the damage was the proceeds from the sale of the bones of the dead horses, at 50 cents per 100 pounds. The hard-working widow repaired and replanted. She did well enough to add 9 acres to the farm and a 2-story addition to the house. Lydia sold the farm to the Gettysburg Memorial Association in 1888. She moved close to the Dobbin House Tavern on Emmitsburg Road. She took the house's 2-story addition with her, and lived there until she died in 1893. The Gettysburg Memorial Association leased the old Leicester farm out to tenants until 1933, when the National Park Service took it over. Meade's Council of War. The main room is where the famous Council of War took place on the night of July 2nd. The tiny room was packed with a dozen generals. George Meade, who had taken over the Army of the Potomac from Joseph Hooker just 4 days before. Daniel Butterfield, the chief of staff Meade inherited from Hooker, took notes at the table. John Newton, who had taken over the 1st Corps from John Reynolds, killed on the first day of the battle. Winfield Scott Hancock, normally 2nd Corps commander, now commanding the center of the Army on Cemetery Ridge. John Gibbon, in temporary command of the 2nd Corps. David B. Birney, who had taken over the 3rd Corps after Daniel Sickles had been wounded that afternoon. George Sykes, who had taken over the 5th Corps from Meade when he was promoted 4 days earlier. John Sedgwick, whose 6th Corps had just reached the battlefield after a 35-mile march. Oliver O. Howard, 11th Corps commander, who for a time after Reynolds died had commanded the entire battlefield. Henry Slocum, normally the 12th Corps commander, temporarily commanding the Army's right wing. Alpheus Williams, temporarily commanding the 12th Corps. Gouverneur Warren, the Army's chief of engineers, who had exhausted himself and suffered a minor wound saving Little Round Top earlier that day, fell asleep on the floor. The bedroom of the Leicester farmhouse. Several tables and chairs were taken into the yard. All her food disappeared, but a small bit of flour and some lard Lydia had hidden under a bench before she left. A shell had torn through the house, knocking a bedstead all to pieces. George Gordon Meade, December 31st, 1815 to November 6, 1872, was a United States Army officer and civil engineer best known for decisively defeating Confederate General Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War. He previously fought with distinction in the Second Seminole War and the Mexican-American War. During the Civil War, he served as a Union general, rising from command of a brigade to that of the Army of the Potomac. Earlier in his career, he was an engineer and was involved in the coastal construction of several lighthouses. Meade's Civil War combat experience started as a brigade commander, brigadier general, in the Peninsula Campaign and the 7 Days Battles. He was severely wounded while leading his brigade at the Battle of Glendale. As a division commander, he had notable success at the Battle of South Mountain and assumed temporary corps command at the Battle of Antietam. Meade's division was arguably the most successful of any at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December. It was part of a force charged with driving the Confederate troops under Stonewall Jackson back from their position on Prospect Hill. The division made it further than any other, but was forced to turn back due to a lack of reinforcements. Meade was promoted to commander of the V Corps, which he led during the Battle of Chancellorsville. During the Gettysburg campaign, he was appointed to command the Army of the Potomac just 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg. Arriving on the field after the first day's action on July 1st, Meade organized his army on favorable ground to fight an effective defensive battle against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, repelling a series of massive assaults throughout the next 2 days. Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia, ending his hope of winning the war through a successful invasion of the North. This victory was marred by Meade's ineffective pursuit during the retreat, allowing Lee and his army to escape instead of completely destroying them. The Union Army also failed to follow up on its success during the Bristow Campaign and Battle of Mine Run that fall, which ended inconclusively. Meade suffered from intense political rivalries within the Army, notably with Major General Daniel Sickles, who tried to discredit Meade's role in the victory at Gettysburg. In 1864 to 1865, Meade continued to command the Army of the Potomac through the Overland Campaign, the Richmond-Petersburg Campaign, and the Appomattox Campaign, but he was overshadowed by the direct supervision of the General-in-Chief, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, who accompanied him throughout these campaigns. Grant conducted most of the strategy during these campaigns, leaving Meade with significantly less influence than before. His image was harmed by his notoriously short temper and disdain for the press. After the war, he commanded several important departments during Reconstruction. George Gordon Meade was born on December 31st, 1815, in Cadiz, Spain, the 8th of 11 children of Richard Worsam Meade and Margaret Coates Butler. His family were Pennsylvanians of Catholic, part Irish descent. His father, of a Philadelphia merchant family, had become wealthy in the American-Spanish trade and was appointed U.S. naval agent. He was ruined financially because of his support of Spain in the Peninsular War. His family returned to the United States in 1817, in precarious financial straits. He died in 1828 when Meade was not yet a teenager. His elder brother Richard Worsam Meade too became a naval officer, while several sisters married military men. Likewise, young George attended the American Classical and Military Lyceum in Philadelphia and the Mount Hope Institution in Baltimore, and entered the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1831. He graduated 19th in his class of 56 cadets in 1835. Meade was commissioned a brevet second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery, his first assignment being in Florida, fighting against the Seminole Indians. He became a full second lieutenant by year's end, and in the fall of 1836, he resigned from the Army, a career he had not intended to pursue, even while attending West Point. He worked as a civil engineer for the Alabama, Georgia, and Florida Railroad and for the War Department. On December 31, 1840, his birthday, he married Margaretta Sargent, daughter of John Sargent, running mate of Henry Clay in the 1832 presidential election. They had 7 children together: John Sargent Meade, George Meade, who became a colonel in the U.S. Army, Margaret Butler Meade, Spencer Meade, Sarah Wise Meade, Henrietta Meade, and William Meade. Meade considered himself deserving of a corps command after the hard service he'd performed during the summer 1862 campaigns, but instead Daniel Butterfield, his junior in rank and a political appointee, received command of the V Corps on November 16. New Army of the Potomac commander Ambrose Burnside told Meade that this was only a temporary arrangement. He replaced Butterfield in command of the Corps on Christmas Day, but a month later was elevated to Grand Division Command after the departure of William B. Franklin. After Hooker's dissolution of the Grand Division system, Meade was returned to command of V Corps, which he led in the Battle of Chancellorsville. The following spring, General Hooker, then commanding the Army of the Potomac, had grand plans for the campaign, but was unsuccessful in execution, allowing the Confederates to seize the initiative. Meade's corps was left in reserve for most of the battle, contributing to the Union defeat. Afterward, Meade argued strongly with Hooker for resuming the attack against Lee, but to no avail. Hooker resigned from command of the Army of the Potomac while pursuing Lee in the Gettysburg campaign. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1863, a messenger from President Abraham Lincoln arrived to inform Meade of his appointment as Hooker's replacement. Meade was taken by surprise and later wrote to his wife that when the officer entered his tent to wake him, he assumed that Army politics had caught up with him and he was being arrested. He had not actively sought command and was not the president's first choice. John F. Reynolds, one of 4 major generals who outranked Meade in the Army of the Potomac, had earlier turned down the president's suggestion that he take over. The 4 generals, Reynolds, John Sedgwick, Henry Slocum, and Winfield Hancock, recommended him for command of the army and agreed to serving under him despite outranking him. During the 3 days, Meade made excellent use of capable subordinates, such as Major Gens John F. Reynolds and Winfield S. Hancock, to whom he delegated great responsibilities. Unfortunately for Meade's reputation, he did not skillfully manage the political manipulators he inherited from Hooker. Major Gens Daniel Sickles, 3 Corps commander, and Daniel Butterfield, Meade's chief of staff, caused him difficulty later in the war, questioning his command decisions and courage. Sickles had developed a personal vendetta against Meade because of Sickles's allegiance to Joseph Hooker, whom Meade had replaced, and because of controversial disagreements at Gettysburg. Sickles had either mistakenly or deliberately disregarded Meade's orders about placing his corps in the defensive line, which led to that corps' destruction and placed the entire army at risk on the second day of battle. Radical Republicans, some of whom like Thaddeus Stevens were former know-nothings, and hostile to Irish Catholics like Meade's family, in the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War suspected that Meade was a copperhead and tried in vain to relieve him from command. Following their severe losses at Gettysburg, General Lee's army retreated to Virginia. Meade was criticized by President Lincoln and others for not aggressively pursuing the Confederates during their retreat. Meade's perceived caution stemmed from 3 causes: casualties and exhaustion of the Army of the Potomac, which had engaged in forced marches and heavy fighting for a week, heavy general officer casualties that impeded effective command and control, and a desire to guard a hard-won victory against a sudden reversal. In 1865, Meade was admitted as an honorary member of the Pennsylvania Society of the Cincinnati. Meade was a commissioner of Fairmount Park in Philadelphia from 1866 until his death. The people of Philadelphia gave his widow a house at 1836, Ulanzi Place, where he lived. The house still has the word Meade over the door, but it is now used as apartments. He also held various military commands, including the Department of the East and the Department of the South. He replaced Major General John Pope as governor of the Reconstruction 3rd Military District in Atlanta on January 10, 1868.